Hey everyone! Before we begin, a quick shout out to Josh Chambers, who helped fix a slight bump I had run into with the series, and all the other supporting comments as well. I'm glad to know that you guys have my back. Also, don't forget to support us on the Looping Real Gaming channel for more Let's Play content, as in August, I'm going to focus more on the narrative content on this channel, and you can find a link to our Looping Real Gaming channel in the description down below. Thanks! The war that was continuing in America seemed never to diminish, as more and more allies of the Entente headed their way towards friendly shores. The Canadians had suffered great losses throughout, but other Entente members also had a price to pay in blood. The strength of the eastern shoreline was dwindling, with so many US soldiers migrating towards the southern borders of Canada. Europe seemed calm, but across the many divided nations, visions of war were brewing, and it was all but the question, who would strike first? Chances were high that this would be Russia, as it now declared an interest in European nations to reclaim after having done so successfully in Asia and the Middle East. The naval invasion by the West Indies also proved no success, as they did not have enough troops to hold the area and expand upon it once CSA resistance was met. For the Syndicalist forces, it proved difficult to make a large push up north with the Australasians and US infantry reinforcing the line. But that line was simply too big to hold altogether, and now CSA units were also spotted heading into Canada to the east. As a result, the King reached towards the emergency reserves to function as another line wherever they were needed. About 15,000 troops would be recruited for this final defense. Chaos was everywhere, and Africa was also not spared, as the Civil War had drowned all nations into an all-out conflict. It was difficult to keep track, with several factions gaining and losing territory every other week. From the sea to the east, more ships from Europe and Africa were heading in to provide the US troops with supplies, reinforcements, and weaponry. With American forces having entered Canadian territory, King Edward VIII addressed the Canadian public via radio with a grim message. He called for the Canadians to rise up and fight the combined syndicates of America, to resist with the knowledge that this was the last stand of the British Empire. It was here in Canada that the question of freedom would be decided. "We must not fall," he urged, and Canadians across the country rallied to his side in this, their most desperate hour. CSA forces were plagued by civil resistance and guerrilla fighters everywhere. Down south, things were rumbling as well, as news came out that Peru declared war on Ecuador. Latin America was also a ticking time bomb, where revolutionaries could seize opportunities to their advantage. And in Asia, where the Mongolians had seized so much power that, much like Icarus, they might now have flown too close to the sun, as rumor would have it that they had caught the attention of Russia to the north. Washington, that had changed owners over the past months multiple times, was once again lost to the CSA troops, as its ruins left an area that had more symbolic value than actual one. The Kaiser in Germany, who had to endure some increased negativity ever since Black Monday, with the loss of his African rule now being the most recent disaster, was taking very careful steps to strengthen his political power on a small, daily basis instead of making steps far and in between. The civil war in Spain also continued, as always, with no end in sight. The Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek seemingly had the upper hand over the Union of South Africa, with supporting troops being sent from countries nearby. The area that had been connecting Canada to the US-held territory had been cut off by the CSA, giving them control over multiple harbors as well. The CSA altogether held an incredible amount of territory and manpower, but the number of men in the field grew thin as they took heavy losses, and it proved difficult to keep every position reinforced enough to where every victory was bought with another loss. Though progress was slow, CSA troops managed to dig deeper into the flesh of Canada as the western front line shifted ever so slightly to the north. The 15,000 troops drummed up by the king and led by General Bert Hofmeister made their way to secure this part together with the US and Australasian allies. US troops managed to retake some ports again along the shore, and also retake Washington in the process, creating a seemingly everlasting tug-of-war effect. In Africa, multiple war situations came to a resolve, with the continent still thrown into chaos despite the number of wars diminishing. It was still difficult to make out what was happening and who would be the dominant victor in the end. And by the end of September, the rumors in the east proved to be true, as Russia, despite making moves towards Europe, declared war on the Mongols, who grew too arrogant and aggressive for their own good in their opinion. Despite the US forces being able to retake some cities and its ports, they were not able to re-establish a proper connection with Canada, and to make matters worse, the West Indies were almost driven back towards the sea by an overwhelming enemy force coming from the center. With Africa having exploded, one of the benefits regarding the Entente was the increased power of Portugal. The positions were not ideal, and there were many warring states in between the Portugal-held territory, but the Civil War gave opportunity for the country to strengthen its grip for country and faction alike. The war between the new Khan and the Russians was a war across the entire borderline. Due to the rumors sparking unrest in the weeks prior to this, the Mongolian army was able to react fast to the war declaration. The American and Canadian troops along the eastern coast were threatened to be cut off from the main forces to the west as some of the CSA troops headed up north. It seemed that war and bloodshed had become the norm for this world. With the syndicalists heading north, an opportunity presented itself, as some US and Canadian forces were able to head east and cut off the supply routes, crippling the syndicalists currently in Canada. The West Indies, who were struggling for the past weeks around the area of New Orleans, got reinforced by their French allies, who were able to hold as the West Indies licked their wounds. The Union of South Africa displayed a dominant role over the previously more aggressive Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek. It would not take long before they had been routed out. The attack to the east by the Canadians and US troops seemed a success at first, but they soon arrived at the same issue that so many of the CSA infantry had. The landmass they had to traverse was simply too big for 1,000 to 2,000 men. It did not take long before their taken territory was cut up into pieces by weaker enemy units. The battle in Russia was one of the fiercest yet. The casualty numbers were incredibly high. Russia suffered a huge number of dead soldiers compared to the Mongolians in such a short time, but there were always more soldiers to spare for them. Things calmed down a bit in the south as Ecuador and Peru had come up with a peace deal. The West Indies managed to pull off another naval invasion to the south and west of their current armies, where they had barely met any enemy resistance. And then the Dominionists won in South Africa. The civil war that had been ravaging South Africa was bloody and bitter, dividing across ethnicities, political ideology, and ancestry. The Dominionists fought to defend the Cape, while the isolated South Rhodesia protected Salisbury with every man they had, and the Afrikaners fought furiously on two fronts. As the dust settled, the Dominionists seemed to have come ahead, with the troops of Rhodesia and the Federation finally reuniting after a decisive push on Pretoria. If South Rhodesia would soon rejoin their federation, their bravery would probably further inspire the Rhodesian people. The Federation, on the other hand, would soon be looking outwards to the Entente. But with one war ending, another one was created, as the princely federation in India was challenged from within. And the never-ending civil war in Spain once again ran into the direction of a syndicalist victory, though they had been in this position before with unlucky results. With the war between the Russians and the Mongolians, Russia seemingly changed its perspective on the European direction and instead now looked towards the Middle East. The princely federation seemed to have trouble with the uprising occurring, much to the amusement of the Dominion of India to the north. In Europe, several countries were preparing for war. Something big was coming. Mussolini had ordered rigorous military training exercises across the whole country for what would come next. And then, in the last month of 1938, suddenly the tide seemed to have turned. The CSA did not have enough troops and manpower to hold such a widespread landmass, and for the first time in weeks, the Americans and Canadians pushed the CSA south again. This could be the time where the war turned into their favor.